Hey guys, this is Mike from Deepwood Force of Will here, coming at you with yet another deck profile. This one though is not my deck. This is not a deck that was played in any of our videos. This deck actually comes directly from Mr. Alex Goodman over at the Grinning Remnant. He's recently putting out a lot of articles on Millium. He's a massive Fairy Tale fan, a massive Grimm fan, and this has been sort of his pet project. And he reached out to me and said, "Hey, can you do deck profile on this deck?" So I'm like, I cannot say no to that. I love playing around with fairy tales, love playing around with Millium, so this was kind of a no-brainer. So, Alex, hope this is what you're looking for, because this deck is very cool, and if you guys haven't already, please check out Alex's articles on this deck. It's fantastic, the way he built it. So, starting off strong, we've got our ruler Millium, of course, the star of the show. Alex goes over him very, very well in his article based on it. But if you guys don't know already, or if you haven't read that article at all, he is a human ruler, judgments for 3, 2 light and 1 colorless, energizes for white, and he says that you can pay the cost of any fairy tale resonator with light will. So no matter what that fairy tale's attribute, as long as you have light will to pay for it, you can play it. And that's a very relevant ability going forward. When we flip him over, he becomes a 900/900 human J ruler. When he enters your field, you put the top card of your Magic Stone deck into your field. Doesn't have to come in rested, so he immediately pays for himself when he comes in, which is fantastic, especially because this deck has a lot of really cheap stuff. Again, he retains the ability to play fairy tales with will of any attribute on his backside, which is fantastic because you don't have to sacrifice any of your will producing in order to make him judgment. And whenever he attacks or blocks, you force and you roll a die one time. You put X plus 100 counters on him, where X is the total of that die roll. So if you roll 1, he gains +1/+1. Roll a 6, he gains +600/+600. Those are counters, so they stay on him. So eventually, if you start attacking and blocking, those start to add up very quickly. And after a few die rolls, normally Millium will be too big for somebody to clear with their removal options. So really, really cool ruler. Definitely overshadowed by some other rulers currently, just due to the fact that he's more of a tempo card, but definitely not a bad card to play around with, and I recommend checking him out and playing around with him, especially with the deck in this video. So, the stone base, which I normally go into next, there's really not much to say. It's all light stones. This is a mono light deck. You can play anywhere between 10 and 20. I have 10 because I only have 10 different artworks for light magic stones. The reason for this, you don't have to do this. You can make them all the same color, all not the same, well, the same artwork, not the same artwork. It doesn't matter, but I just like to make people kind of uncomfortable by having a bunch of different artworks. So, there's that. This one's my favorite, though, because it's a Valhalla artwork. Stones are pretty relevant from there, but what is relevant is that main deck, where we get to see which fairy tales come together to make this a really effective deck. First on the list is Dreaming Girl Wendy. Wendy's probably one of the premier fairy tale resonators, just because of her main ability is that whenever another fairy tale resonator comes into play, you recover her. So if you attack, she's rested, you play a fairy tale, she recovers, and then you can attack with her again, which is really, really strong when you're making a more aggressive fairy tale based deck. She also gains +200/+200 as long as you have a magic stone and control no special magic stones. Again, this is a mono light deck, so this effect will always be in play, which means that Wendy is consistently a 1-mana 400/500, which is great. And then as long as you control Peter Pan, she cannot be attacked, and she gains flying. So you can't target her down with attacks, you can't block her if you don't have a flyer, so she becomes a relevant threat when Peter's on the board. And Peter can also bring her out, which we'll see later. But Wendy's kind of the bread and butter of most of your main win conditions and main combos, so definitely good to have her all the time. From there we have 4 Tinkerbell, the fairy. Tinkerbell is, of course, one of your other main beat sticks. It's a 1-mana 100/100 with flying, but she gains +200/+200 for each of the fairy tale resonator you control. Again, you're playing a lot of cheap fairy tales, such as Wendy, such as some other fairy tales you'll see later in this video. I don't want to give anything away, but she can quickly amp up to like on average like a 700 or 900 for 1 mana, which is great. So definitely another piece to your combos here, and definitely one of the main things that you'll be using to swing for game. And now, good news about both of those is that they're 1-cost fairy tales, so they can be summoned with Peter Pan. Eternal Boy Peter Pan is a 500/600 with flying. When he enters your board, you search your deck for a 1-cost fairy tale and put it into your field. That can be Tinkerbell, that can be Wendy, that can be a couple other cards you're about to see, but Peter Pan is definitely one of your big combo makers, and he just continues to help your strategy of swarming the board and overwhelming your opponent with big fairy tales. So, definitely a really good card, definitely a 4 for the deck. From there we have another 4 of, unfortunately of which I only have 2 of, so the next card on the list is Red Riding Hood, Rainbow to the Heavens. I never remember the rest of her name. Little Red is just Red Riding Hood in this incarnation is a Will of Hope card, a 1 mana 400/400, which are good stats starting off. Her seal effect, though, once you have 3 or more magic stones, is that she gains flying and swiftness. Now, something to note about Peter Pan is that he's a 3 mana card. So you summon him when you have 3 stones, you bring out your Red Riding Hood, and she immediately comes with flying and swiftness, which is fantastic. So definitely a really good 4 of in the deck, definitely another way to overpower and aggress and aggro down your opponent. Hopefully I'll be getting more of these soon, but for now, we've got a nice full art one, whatever regular art, and then backwards cards to represent the rest of them. On to the next card, we have 2 Captain Hook. This deck does not consider the current European ban list for Force of Will, so since this is a US-based deck, Captain Hook is still here. But Captain Hook is a very, very powerful card. We know because it got banned, but in this deck, it's more of just a card that you want to ramp up your stones into. It's a high-cost fairy tale that has a very, very significant effect as it comes into play, where it tosses stones back into the deck. Now, you're playing all basic stones, you're trying to ramp up your stones with cards like Soul, Envoy of Light, which we'll be seeing in a little bit. So getting to hook before your opponent has time to really set themselves up and knock them back a few stones while you have a stone advantage already is incredible. So Hook's definitely a staple card in decks like these. Next we have 2 Grim, the Pitch Black Vampire. Grim is a very interesting card in this deck just because it is a 900/900 with flying for 4 mana, which is great. Again, it's a fairy tale, so you can play it for 4 white will, which is great. When it comes to play, you get to recycle a Resonator from your graveyard. Now, because this is a swarm-based deck, recycling Resonators, especially the cheaper Resonators, will keep you in the game longer. Grim's just kind of your big push card when you're going a little bit further into the late game. Only bad thing is that you can't use his last ability where you get to deal -X100, -X100 to other cards based on the number of fairy tales you control, just because it's a black cost ability and you only have white will to pay. But that's a small price to pay for having technically infinite recursion with 2 of these guys. So definitely a very strong card. One of the very few Raya Cluster cards we see in this deck. The second of which is Dark Riding Hood. Another Fairy Tale Resonator come out of Raya Cluster. Dark Riding Hood has a multitude of effects based on your life total, so if you're going to the late game and your opponent is trying to out-aggress you, out-aggro you, you start getting other abilities such as, I'll read it for you guys because I still have to read through this card really. Basically she gains what's considered Death Touch and Magic on her front side when your life is 2,000 or less, or if it deals damage to a Resonator, you destroy that Resonator. At 1,000 life or less, she gains Swiftness. When she enters your field, you remove 2 mystery counters from your J Ruler. If you do, remove target Resonator from the game. Again, you won't be using that because Million doesn't use the mystery counters. And whenever she attacks, you deal 200 damage to target player or Resonator and gain 200 life. So she gets a little bit of life steal with that too. You could deal it to your opponent, you could deal it to Resonators, and she just kind of helps to steamroll you further, helps to clear off smaller things, so your small things can attack unhindered, which is really, really nice. Next on the list is the Seven Dwarves. Seven Dwarves is really strange. It comes into play with 7 +100/+100 counters, so it's technically a 3 mana 700/700, which isn't too great, but whenever it takes damage, you can remove a +100/+100 counter, and then prevent all the damage that was done. So basically it takes damage in the form of 100 damage each, which is pretty nice. So Definitely a cool, resilient card. Can help to solidify your board and continue forth. Moving on from the fairy tales, we've got non-fairy tales now. The main one of which is Soul, Envoy of Light. Now, Soul's a very, very interesting card in this particular deck, just because, again, it's the reason that you play mono light stones other than Wendy. A combination of Soul and Wendy makes this deck probably one of the best shells for a mono light deck. Soul, when it comes into play, you reveal the top card of your deck. If it's a non-special light magic stone, it comes into play. Not rested, so you get to use it immediately, which means you can play any of your super cheap fairy tales immediately afterwards. So, definitely really strong for this deck. Helps to set you up to the late game, and helps you ramp into stuff like Grim and Hook. So, a very powerful powerhouse card. Another thing is that he ramps you up to 3 mana, so you can ramp into a Judgment if you use him on turn 2. Now, the last Resonator out of the deck is Zero, the Kingsblade. Now, Zero is a 2 mana, 600/600 Will of Hope with Quick Cast. So, it's one of the few cards in this deck that can be played on your opponent's turn. And also, it sets restrictions up for your opponent where they can't draw cards if it's not their first draw they've had this turn. And Resonators cannot be bounced to the owner's hand, which is also really, really good, just because a lot of decks can potentially have effects that try to out-tempo you by moving your stuff back to your hand or moving your stuff off the board. Zero helps to alleviate that a little bit and gives you a way to sink your will in if you happen to have any floating white will. So, really strong. Also, quick note, the Will of Hope keywords on Zero and Red Riding Hood will come into play a little bit later in this deck. Moving on to the spells of the deck, we have 2 Amaterasu's Foresight. Foresight's just really good if you're trying to stall out your opponent a little bit, set up a board, and maybe even set up lethal damage on the next turn. So having ways to prevent your opponent from dealing damage to your Resonators with their Resonators is really, really good. Same principle goes for Zero's Magic Light. It's just, if something attacks and you don't like it, pay 2 will, remove it from the game. Not really much else to say about that card. It's just very, very powerful for the cost, for how it's used, and using it in a more aggressive style deck like this means that you can get rid of problem cards if they're attacking or blocking, which is another really solid factor. Next on the list is Magic Sweets. Magic Sweets gives target J Resonator you control +200/+200 and barrier. So having a quick cast way and a very cheap quick cast way to give something you control the ability to just not be targeted, help it survive if it gets targeted down by an attack, definitely helps to solidify a board, which you really want to do with this deck. You want to keep a board, swing with it, and make your opponent lose the game. So Magic Sweets definitely helps you do that. The last 2 cards are one-ofs, first of which is Summoning from the Fairy Tale World. I like to use this art because there's a doggo on it. The best thing is that this card can search your deck for a Fairy Tale Resonator. However, if your ruler is Millium, you get searched for 2 instead, which is really good because it helps you set up for later game. If it's turn 4, you play Soul, get another stone, play this, search for a hook, have a hook ready for next turn. That's really strong. Having the ability to search out Dark Riding Hood in the late game is also fantastic, so this card has a lot of really good implications in this deck. And then the last card we have is Real's Volition. This is a 3-will target J Resonator you control gains +800/+800 barrier and flying until end of turn. So it's just a wad of buffs mashed into one card. But if the big thing that I was talking about before, especially with regard to Zero the Kingsblade and Red Riding Hood, is that you may pay white and 1 less to play it if it targets something with Will of Hope. So if you target your Red Riding Hood or your Zero the Kingsblade, this card costs 1 for all of these effects, which is fantastic, especially for trying to set up like a big board, a big push towards the late game. If your opponent's trying to kill off your big threats, you just play this for 1, and you get a massive, massive buff to that Resonator. So really, really strong card. Definitely recommend trying it out with, even though this deck does have a pretty limited amount of Will of Hope cards, most of them are searchable in the form of Red Riding Hood, and definitely appreciate the resilience that comes from that +800/+800 and barrier that comes with this. So that is actually the entire deck. It's a pretty straightforward deck, very aggressive Fairy Tale build, but a very effective aggressive Fairy Tale build where you just swarm the board with a bunch of 1-drops, a bunch of 3-drops, go into the late game with Grim and Hook, swarm and overwhelm your opponent, and just make them have to think on their toes the whole time they're getting pounded and destroyed by these Fairy Tales. So, definitely a very fun deck. I appreciate that Alex reached out and wanted me to give a little overview of this deck for what he's doing. So thanks again to him. If you haven't already, definitely give Million a whirl. Give your Monolight engines the love that they deserve with Soul. And hopefully I will see you guys all testing this deck out and showing what you've done with it as well. This has been Mike from Deepwood Force of Will, signing out.